Thank you very much. Yes, we only have 40 minutes, so it's a really tight timetable. Hello, I'm Sian Lockwood. I'm one of the 3 co-facilitators of this event. Because it's such a tight time scale, we're going to use the chat a lot for you to post questions and comments. The purpose of today is to think about whether faith communities have a role in providing a place of belonging support for people who are aging without children, or aging generally. I thought we'd introduce ourselves briefly. I'm Sian. Some of you know me, some of you don't. I have a very long history of work in community development and helping local people help other local people, really. But I've also a long faith history. I've been part of the Anglican Church since I was a little one, and I became a churchwarden of my large central city centre church about 5 years ago, and it's a busy church, and my interest is really becoming very aware of how important the church community was for a number of people who were getting older and didn't have children. So the church was playing all sorts of roles in supporting that. So this is my interest. I wonder if I could ask Monica, would you introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, I'm Monica Slocum, and I'm a member of AWOC Leeds, and I've been a member since since it started. Met Kirsty, and it started nearly 10 years ago now. My interest in faith is that I'm also a churchwarden at a very, very large religious C of E organisation. And I'm on the governing body of it as well. So, and I know that we have a lot of older people who are single, who have become single, who are gay, and for one reason or another do not have any children. And it doesn't seem to be an issue amongst the faith community, because there's such focus on children. So we'll talk more about that as we go along. So my interest is obviously I'm AWOC, so that's me.
And Bernadette, if you could just introduce yourself briefly, that would be wonderful. Are you able to speak, Bernadette? Are you there, Bernadette?
Yes, I can speak now. I couldn't unmute myself. My name is Bernadette. I'm a vicar in the East End of London. And I guess I started to think, well, I'm also aging without children. We're a small congregation, but with an age range from people in their 20s to people in their 90s. And I guess I think in many ways the church does have a role to play, and actually does play that role in terms of pastoral care. It's how that could happen at a more strategic level. I think quite often in churches it happens by default.
Thank you. So this is your panel. And what we plan to do, because it's such a short, we've got 4 slides, that's all. And what we plan to do is go to each slide, talk ourselves about it a bit from the different viewpoints, and then invite your comments. And I've asked Angela in particular to just check the comments and sort of feed them into the conversation as we go along. I'd like to cover all the slides, so we've got about 8 minutes for each, and I've got a stopwatch, so I'm going to move us through so we don't miss anything. So if you could move to the next slide. As the question is, do and can faith communities provide support for people who are aging without children? So that's the question we're thinking about today. If you go to the next slide. Which is somewhere to belong. The at their best, and that's a big proviso, really, but at their best, faith communities of all kinds provide a place where people feel they belong. It's the reason I went back to my church after many years without it, because I needed a place to belong, and it provides that for me. But and I suppose the questions I want my panel to think about are: is the church ageist? Does the church value its older people, with or without children, actually? And what about people who stand outside the norms of the faith community? So, for example, older people who are LGBTQ+. So I wonder if we could start with that first question. Is the church ageist? And I'd be really interested in, Monica, you started to talk about that.
Yes. Well, it's difficult, isn't it? Because there's always a lot of emphasis on families and children. But there is it's certainly true that older people are sometimes they're marginalised. They like tradition, and sometimes because the younger people want something different, it makes it hard for them to join in with what's going on, and they're felt to be second class sometimes, I think. But I would say that my own experience is that the older people probably do the vast majority of the volunteering and have a place to belong, a place to be. They come faithfully every week, and are a fundamental part of our community in every way. They support the younger families, and they support people of their own age too. So I think there has to be a spread of age within the church. With regard to LGBTQ, I have to say my own experience is of seeing how my own organisation, my own church operates, is that we have vast numbers of people who are LGBTQ within the community. We have staff as well as congregation and volunteers, and the whole range is encompassed. I have to say it is a city centre church in West Yorkshire, so we have a lot of people of other colours and ethnic minorities who come and join us as well. So the whole spread is accounted for. I sometimes think the issues around aging without children aren't even understood. It's met with a blank face whenever I mention it.
Bernadette, what's your view on?
I would broadly agree with Monica. I think in many ways, most churches, most of the volunteers are older people. But I would also say the energy and the focus strategically, for example, in London, the Diocese of London has one of its, in its mission action plan for 2030, is growing younger. So on one hand, you know, I think kind of the church has two attitudes towards older people. One, I think on one level it recognises that a lot of the work that happens within a church couldn't take place without older people. But yet it's constantly seeking younger people. So and I sometimes wonder what message does that give to older people in the congregation.
And what about people who stand outside the norms of faith? I mean, Monica was talking about people from LGBTQ plus communities. Have you got any thoughts on that? I know we talked about that last night.
I think there's, you see, there's the church as an institution, and then you have the local church, and at a local level, our church is, well, it's very different from yours, Monica. It's a very Poor East End of London church, and we are very inclusive as a church of LGBTQI+. and we do that publicly in terms of, you know, our logo has the rainbow flag on it. You know, we've joined Flissive Church. We're looking at setting up an open table, joining the open table network. But you go, you know, 2 churches up the road, and the theology of that church, LGBT plus people, might be welcome, but wouldn't occupy any positions of leadership within the church purely on account of sexuality. So I think it varies. And the wider church, you know, in terms of the Church of England, is going through, you know, a process of the living in love and faith process, which is moving very slowly. So change is happening, but again, it will be down in terms of LGBTQI plus people. It will depend on it depends on who the vicar is and who the leadership in that church is.
Angela, you were talking, you're absolutely right. This is an Anglican panel. We're all members of the Anglican Church one way or another, and but actually faith communities of all faiths have a role here. So I don't know, you asked a question, which is, are people of other faiths in the room? I don't think you've had an answer to that, have you?
I haven't, no. I was just interested because I think I do wonder. There's been discussion in the chat about how, and as Bernadette said, that, you know, churches, you know, you go 2 churches down the road and it's a different response or a different situation. And I suppose my instinct was that's going to be the same within other faiths, and that some may be more or less good at this stuff, you know. So I suppose that was why I raised the question. I just thought it'd be interesting if there was anybody in the room that had other perspectives. It would be nice to have that other perspective.
Zakaya has just said that it's a similar experience for people from Muslim communities. Am I allowed to? Are we able to unmute anybody, Angela? We haven't got huge amounts of time, but I'd be interested in knowing more about that.
Joe would say, but I think we can. I think I can. Do I have the power, Joe? Am I allowed?
Yes, you do have the power.
Right, I'm unmuting Zakaya. Oh, there we go. Alphabetical, you see. You know what that means?
Right at the end, with the Z.
Yes, that's what it is. I think I've asked Zakaya to unmute. Have I?
Yes, hi there. Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello, Zakaya. It would just be interesting to know a little bit more. We're aware this is a bit Anglican heavy, this panel. So
yeah, sure. So from my experience, I found it's very similar to some of the comments that have already been made, in the sense that individuals may feel a bit overwhelmed in terms of initially getting access to faith centres, and there might be various differentiations within the Muslim community as well. So, for example, there might be an older individual and they might actually live next to a mosque. However, if they are not connected to that mosque or that particular Islamic belief, then they usually wouldn't go to that particular mosque. They would prefer to go to a different one, which might be further away, and then it's getting access to that as well. Because even with a lot of mosques, it's very similar to temples as well, where they have different sects of Islam, so different beliefs as to the faith as well, where older people may not actually access that particular religious group because of the stigma and stereotype. If they do, what will the community think about them, and so on. That's a brief summary.
thank you very much. My little timer went, but Rena, you've got your hand up. Is it possible to quickly unmute, Rena?
Yeah.
Are you able to say,
You're giving
quite
me
quickly?
too much to do now. Let me just see if I can.
You shouldn't have joined the group, Angela.
No. Rena Popat, is that right?
Yes, that's right. I'm sorry. I
Oh,
think
already.
my camera's playing up. So bear with me. I'm still working on interested in the South Asian community, and you know, although there is a lot of support from temples, mosques, but you know, the expectations are crumbling, especially within the South Asian community. Elders have expectations from their children that it will be, because it's culturally expected that elders would be looked after, and that is not happening. So although this talk is on the Anglican Church, I would like to hear more about other community faiths, and also especially the South Asian community for myself.
I think that's a very decent challenge, Rena, and I think it is accidental, really, that our panel happens all to be from the Anglican Church. So we're not intending to talk. We're talking from our own experience, but we're not intending to talk exclusively, because I think you're quite right. I think other faith communities provide important places of belonging, but there are always some limitations to that. I think
there are, especially with the younger generation who are being brought up here. Their ideologies are very, very different. So, you know, especially within the South Asian community, there is no one that many elders can go to, and you know, they are left in a really dire situation. So but perhaps you know, I would love to get involved, because it's a subject that I'm very, very passionate about. So maybe we can speak afterwards about.
This feels like the start of a conversation, doesn't it? And thank you.
Indeed. Indeed.
We have to, Monica, I know you've got your hand up. And can we move to the next slide and deal with that? Because otherwise we're never going to get through all four. But
thank you.
In the conversation, you could start with it. So I'm starting our timer. No, back again, please. There should be one about somewhere to be valued. Oh, I think you've got an old set of slides. I'm really sorry. There was a second set I sent in, but never mind. So the slide that isn't there is a place where people feel valued. I think for faith communities rely on, as we've talked about, and should value their volunteers. And many people get a real sense of purpose and meaning from their volunteer role. And the questions I'm putting to, first of all, to Monica and to Bernadette, and then to the group is, do you think faith communities consciously or unconsciously put limits on who can volunteer? Are the people who are classified in people's minds as people who are there to benefit from being receivers of help? And in that way, do we disable people? So I'm sorry the slide isn't alongside that, but I'd be interested. I'll start with Bernadette first for that. So do you think there are limits on who can volunteer? Do we put limits on who can volunteer?
I think it depends on the church. For example, in my own church, I jokingly said to an elder who would ask me, you know, when can I stop reading the lesson? I said, I'll retire you after 80, or whenever you feel able to. So I again, it's very much the history of the church that I'm in is kind of older people have always been really active in the church. Up well into their late 80s, early 90s. So it's about it's about seeing, it is about seeing older people as people and can contribute. And certainly for some of the activities we as a church ran, we wouldn't have been able to run them if certainly two of our older women who've since passed away, they ran our jumble sales for 40 years. So there is something. I mean, we also have, you know, we had a youth group, and we thought it was always really important. Actually, we'd have intergenerational meals. A few years ago, we were going to celebrate our 60th anniversary, but then COVID hit, and we were the youth group kind of had a meal and interviewed the elders about their experiences and what changed. Sadly, that never got done because. So, I think it's a bit like before I got ordained. I used to work as a social worker, and I was really aware that the care was only as good as the person who was delivering the care, and that varied. And I make the same observation. Other churches may think when someone reaches 60, 70, 80, you know, but it hasn't been my experience. But then I'm the vicar.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, before we go to you, Maggie was saying she didn't see why this was about aging without children, and Angela's just answered that in the chat. Thank you, Angela. It's really whether, I think what we're trying to talk about is whether faith communities of all kinds can provide people who are aging without children with a sense of value, purpose, belonging, as well as practical help. Monica, can I just ask for your response to that, and actually anything else you happen to have wanted to say that I cut you off on?
Thanks. Just to go back to the previous conversation, which was about Asian Muslim people who are AWOC. At one of our meetings, we recently did have an Asian lady who came. She's been a member for a while, but has struggled to come, and she came with her sister. Both are AWOC. Her sister is physically disabled, so she looks after her sister. But the rest of the family and the Muslim community just say, oh, they're there, we're really sorry that you are. And really, she gets very little help. She's expected to look after her sister. The rest of the family don't do it because they're all too busy. So because she has no children, she's ended up having to look after her sister. And that's just an example of how being AWOC is just marginalised, no matter what community you're in. I think it happens in every community, but she did certainly feel that her own community almost ignore her, which is very sad. With regard to volunteers, actually, one of my roles is to manage the volunteers, of which we have vast numbers, probably 80 to 100 volunteers. We're open every day for the public to come in and visit us, and we have events. And I could not run the volunteer rota without people over 60 on the rota. And we don't discriminate about somebody's background or whether they are, or sexuality, or whether they have learning difficulties or mental health problems, of whom we have quite a number. It really doesn't make any difference to us. It's whether they can do the job that we ask them to do. That's far more important to us, and whether they're able to come and enjoy doing it.
Thank you. I'd add one thing, which is my experience, or the experience in the church I go to, is the challenge can come when people can't get into church anymore, and people might get pastoral visits, but it's a very different thing having a pastoral visit from still feeling a purposeful member of your community. So Angela, would you feed in a few of the really interesting comments that have been distracting me as they've come in?
I think there's been some really interesting discussions about kind of subtle subtle stereotype stigmatization from Zakaya and others, subtle ways of people becoming excluded or less included, not overt ones, which I think is quite interesting. As you say, Maggie asked about how this was about aging without children, and a bit of a discussion there about, for me, this feels about, if you are aging without children, do faith communities offer something? Damien very rightly talked about, actually this is about faith groups providing opportunities for people to engage and connect. I was wondering whether there was something in that about reciprocal support as well. And I suppose, see, I don't have faith, so I'm looking at this from the outside, which nobody's particularly probably bothered about that, right? But I suppose I would have really assumed, wrongly or rightly, that faith communities would be huge places of community and support for people who are aging without children. And so I'm fascinated by the fact that the chat, Rena's talking about Asian elders in London, and they're just not being the support for people. And then the points that Zakaya and Rena were making, and in the chat, that doesn't seem to be the case in any faith. So that's been an eye-opener for me. I know nobody's interested in my eyes being opened, but it's fascinating.
No, we're fascinated by your eyes being opened. I'm really glad. I think my own obsession really is that people should continue to have the opportunity to feel valuable, no matter, how much older they get, no matter what kind of aging they experience. And that's probably more important if you're aging without children than if you've got a family around you, because that gives you another sense of purpose and value. So reciprocity, Damien, absolutely, but sometimes people need to feel they're giving as well as receiving. So can I move on to the next slide now, which is practical support?
Just to say, we've got a hand up from Maggie. I don't know if you want to touch on that.
Oh, Maggie, hello. And you've been making some interesting comments.
I may have to invite Maggie to unmute. Oh, no, she's already unmuted. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know if everybody's read what I wrote in the chat about the fact that I haven't been to church for since before the pandemic, because of how it leaves me feel. And just hearing about what was just said now. So I did, when I was going to church, I did get involved in various volunteering kind of aspects, but when seemingly everybody else that I was interacting with, they're 99.9% of the time, their conversations during anything, any activity, any whatever, was always, without exception, about their children, their grandchildren, their, this, that, and the other. And I just can't take that for long, And I am not now prepared to hold my hand up and say, look, this is really difficult for me, because I don't want them feeling sorry for me. I don't want people kind of treating me differently. I don't want, any of that. I just want to be a person the same as everybody else, but I'm not a person the same as everybody else, because I don't have this title of mum. I don't, or grandmother, or, if I was a bloke, father, daddy, I don't have that role. And therefore I am not, or I'm left feeling, having to listen to these conversations, whether in church or anywhere else in society, to be fair, it is too painful just have to sit and listen to it. And as I say, I don't want anyone feeling sorry for me. I don't want to feel othered, you know, so I just can't do it anymore.
I think that's such an important point, Maggie, and it's a learning point for certainly for me, just to be aware of that, because you're absolutely right. The chat, you know, among our volunteers is often a family chat. Monica, you wanted to say something? We've got about 5 minutes left, by the way. I'm completely useless at managing time, but do say what you were going to say.
Well, actually, I totally agree with Maggie. That's exactly what everybody in the AWOT community, when we get together, we all say this, exactly that. I actually left the stitching group at my organisation. We were stitching kneelers, and the conversation was always about grandchildren. The photographs would come out, and I couldn't stomach it anymore, so I left. And now they just say to me, why don't you come and join us? I thought, well, I know why I don't join you, but if I tell you, you will be so incensed, and so you won't even be embarrassed. You'll just think I'm odd. And so I don't talk about it. And I know exactly what Maggie says is true. That's exactly how I feel too. I don't talk about it. Occasionally it comes up, but it's really embarrassing. It doesn't feel as if I'm part of the organisation. I just have to sit on the sidelines.
Monica,
I'm with you.
And Maggie, thank you for that. I know you want to say more, Maggie. I know you want to say more. Would you please let me just get to this last slide, because we've only got 4 minutes, and perhaps we can carry on a conversation outside. I think you've said such an important thing. Practical support. Lots of practical, faith communities are quite good at practical help, many of them, not all of them. And many provide practical help to people inside the faith community and outside it. Lots of things: food, small grants, practical help, housing even. I suppose my question is this helps only for people who are members of that community? And most importantly, do people without faith see faith communities as a possible source of help? I think that's probably the big question. And Angela, I know you're not on my panel, but you've talked a bit about not having a faith. And would you ever see a faith community as somewhere you might go to for practical help? If you
want me to be honest? You want me to be honest?
Yeah.
I would worry about the judgment of the judgment on me of being without faith. And I would also really worry, and rightly or wrongly, you can all cringe, but I would worry that people would want to convert me.
Yeah.
So I would worry that you know what I mean. So I would say no. Not from my perspective. I'd be very worried that I would have to, you know, I'd have to in the same way, Monica, as you're talking about people talking about children and grandchildren, Maggie's really strong point. Me too on that. But also there would be a whole thing about you know, you kind of got to see the positives of the Lord or the whatever faith. You know, and if you don't, then there's something wrong with you. Exactly the same as you, Monica, on the and Maggie on the lack of grandchildren. You know, I would feel that I was double lacking, aging without children and without faith. Yeah. No kids, no faith.
I'm going to ask Monica to respond to that, just because she's nodding her way through that one.
I can so agree with you, Angela. Totally. I do understand that, because we get a lot of people who come in without faith and worry that we're going to convert them. We try to not do that overtly unless somebody actually asks that they want to know a bit more about what's going on. I think one of the problems in terms of practical support is actually, which I do want to try and raise, is about, we've had a couple of our older members who have become ill with dementia and have struggled with their housing and struggled with where they're living and struggled with just practical tasks. And that has become a huge problem, I think. I don't think we deal with it very well. I know that some churches perhaps do. deal with dementia much better. But I actually think that's quite a problem. Somebody who hasn't got any family to support them have ended up, one of our ladies made such a dreadful mistake, sold her house, went into a care home, was so upset, ended up every day getting in a taxi to go to the church just for some support from somebody she knew. She was so upset. And although she got some support, she should have had support much, much earlier in terms of decision making, helping her, because she had no family to help her with that decision. How do you get that practical decision making of big changes in your life?
Yeah. Yes. And I think that, and it's such a specialized role, isn't it? That kind of advocacy support. And Bernadette, I think we've got about 3 seconds. 3 seconds, Bernadette.
Yeah,